Now, I always like to start with two apologies. The first is for my Scottish accent, which of course many of you will have picked up. There is, in fact, up near Inverness, where I come from, a place called Forres, but I always like to apologise for it nonetheless, because I get more Scottish as we go on. And secondly is for the amount of text that's on my slides. Those are a prompt for me, not for you. Please relax your eyes when that comes up and look at the objects instead. Okay, so we're going to start off today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this project, the Mobility of Objects project. We're going to explore some of the medieval objects that were excavated in and around Chester in the Middle Ages, and we'll think a little bit about some of the stories that these objects can tell us. Thirdly, we'll think about why it might be of interest to us to study these medieval objects and to think about them a little bit further. How can we look at them from the past and today think about the ways they might help us understand Chester in the present? And then we'll think about the way in which we should make all of these objects that are within the wonderful collections of the Grosvenor Museum. How do we make them accessible to people like yourselves, to children in schools, and to students of all ages? So, the project. Here's a slide with a lot of text that's really for me. What is this project? Well, I always have to start off with the fact that this project, called the Mobility of Objects Across Boundaries, 1000 to 1700, was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And they very generously gave us the funding to do all of this work from 2018 through to 2022. But as you can see, the project keeps going and it keeps developing in new ways. The other thing I always have to mention is the fact that in Chester we have an amazing collection of medieval objects in the Grosvenor Museum. And I wouldn't have been able to work with these objects without Liz Montgomery, the senior curator of that museum, allowing us to work extensively with the objects, take them out into schools, take them out into the hands of the public. So without Liz, none of this talk or me standing here today would have happened as well. What did we want to do in this project? Well, quite simply, during the period 1000 through to 1700, we have an explosion in objects, in things across Western Europe. And as historians and archaeologists, we still need to learn more about why this explosion in material culture and objects happened. So that was one of the reasons we started out with this project. And we started out by bringing together different academics from different disciplinary disciplines. And as you'll know, that's a very difficult thing to do. It's for us to step out and join together and for archaeologists to talk to historians. But we did that. We brought together archaeologists, art historians, linguists, digital humanists, museum curators, and historians to talk about these objects in handling workshops in the museum. We were especially interested in objects that are everyday, that are ubiquitous, that there are lots of, and that for reasons that some might say these are a little bit dull or mundane, they are overlooked. Maybe that's because they don't have known individuals that they are attached to. They don't have known stories or historical narratives about them. But in fact, of course, because they are used by the majority of the population across Western Europe in that period, they are of great interest, and they can tell us much more about why people in this period of all social groups were owning more things. So, the other aim of the project was that we wanted to make these objects more accessible and more known. So one is to highlight the international significance of the collections of the Grosvenor Museum in the Middle Ages. And the other is to take them out into the hands of pupils, educators, and students of all ages. I'll talk about that at the end. Let's look at the objects, however. You can explore them now. Don't be afraid to wander them around. What stories might they have to tell? Before that, I'd like to think a little bit about why we chose mobility. Again, big slide with lots of text on it that you can recap in the video at your leisure. But why did we choose the mobility of objects? Why did mobility mean a lot to us? Well, in part, through the mobile nature of the objects we were looking at, as historians and archaeologists, we can think about the ways in which these objects encounter different individuals, the ways in which they can change ideas, they can transfer ideas, their motives, and knowledge across geographical boundaries. The idea also of mobility is that although our objects in the Grosvenor Museum are sometimes stuck, either in their stores or they're placed in glass cases and they become static things, these weren't like that in the past. They traveled, they moved, they tell us narratives about a mobile Middle Ages. It also makes us think about the ways in which objects themselves may have transformed the peoples who use them. They may have become meaningful to individuals in the Middle Ages. Okay? So, that's why we chose mobility. But let's look now at some of the objects in the Grosvenor Museum's collection that we looked at and think about some of the stories that they had to tell us. So on the screens just now, we have an image of some of the tiles, and you have some replicas that are circulating around. This slide quite simply shows you the fact that within the Grosvenor collection, we have hundreds and hundreds of medieval tiles, and they have different sizes, shapes, glazes, colors, and designs. They were made to be produced in their multiples. Now, for those of you that are keen-eyed, this is my favorite. This circular medieval tile from the later Middle Ages, 14th century most likely, who has their cheeky little tongue stuck out. So some of the things that they tell us is a little bit about the humor of the Middle Ages. But you can see also that you might also get inscriptions on the tiles. Now, what of these tiles? What are the stories that they might tell us about the Middle Ages and about Chester? The tiles that you saw on the previous slide, most of these have been excavated in and around from ecclesiastical, so church sites, in and around Chester. They are made from clay, as the ones are that are being handed round. They are shaped with a mold, and then they are stamped with a design of the maker's choosing. They are designed to be mass-produced and made in multiples. And what does this tell us? This tells us that in the Middle Ages, there's a huge range of consumers and more demand for these types of objects than ever before. Things are really getting going in terms of being produced in multiples. Some of the tiles are glazed in different colors, and sometimes the glazes have faded over time, but for the ones that are coming round, you can see how shiny they are and the way that they have different feels, and they might refract the light in different ways. Let's talk now about this tile here. This is the 3-hare tile. Now, this is a very famous tile. I'm holding a replica of it in my hands. And this tile was excavated from the nave of Chester Cathedral in 1996. It dates from the later 14th century. Not this one, but obviously the one in the Grosvenor collections. Liz doesn't let me take it out of the collection. So, if you stare intently, as I know you are, at the screens, you'll be able to see that the motif here in the middle is a visual riddle or a puzzle. And you've worked it out already. I know that each hare has 2 ears, but only 3 ears are drawn on the tile. Well, what does this tell us? Well, there's a little play here. There's a little puzzle. Designs are made to do this for medieval people, but it has a bigger context, this design. Design is a copy of a motif from cave at Dunhuang in China. So this motif actually originated in China in the 6th and the 7th centuries. And I say that with some confidence, but actually, this cave complex was excavated, and in it they found the 3 hare motif on some of the silks and the paintings in the cave. Now, some historians have suggested there may be an earlier genesis for the 3 hare motif, quite likely, no doubt. But what's very interesting is that this motif has then been translated across media, across the ages, and across global boundaries. So we see it on a Mongolian coin in the later 13th century. We see it, this design being embedded in churches across Western Europe in the 14th century, some in Paderborn in Germany, and another in Sprayton Church in England, and these are in the 14th and the 15th centuries. So what is the story this tells us then as historians or archaeologists or students of this? Well, there's a real complexity here, isn't there, in the translation of this motif across the centuries and across global territories. It points to the complexity and the cultural influences that are wrought by trade through the Silk Roads. It tells us about the movement of peoples in this period from the east through to the west. So while the tile, Arnchester Cathedral, does not necessarily move, or it's fixed into the cathedral nave, the motif has moved, and so its meaning and its symbolism of the 3 hare changes according to the individuals that it comes into contact with. So it tells us of a mobile Middle Ages. Pilgrim badges and devotional tokens. Now, when we first studied these, I thought, I'm not sure how to approach these actually as an academic. It wasn't something I was very familiar with, but they soon became my absolute favorite objects from the project. Now, on the PowerPoint here, these pilgrim badges and devotional tokens are completely the wrong size. So hopefully some of the ones, the replicas that are coming round, give you a sense that they're much smaller than this, no more than an inch or a couple of inches in size. And in the Grosvenor collection, again, they have an internationally significant collection of pilgrim badges and devotional tokens. The ones that I'm showing here, we have different designs. We have handles that were meant to be attached to spoons. Again, this is another apostle here who would have been attached to a spoon, in fact. We have ones that are perhaps as badges, and others where we have broken parts of the tokens, again, that are designed to be worn on hats or on, I want to say jackets, but that's not right, cloaks. That's what I'm going for there. So, what do these devotional pilgrim badges and devotional tokens, what are some of the stories they tell us? Okay, well, firstly, again, it's a mobile Middle Ages. All of the pilgrim badges and devotional tokens that survive in the Grosvenor Museum came into Chester through people travelling around Western Europe. And the Grosvenor collection has badges from Rome, Siena, Aachen, and Santiago Compostela, as well as pilgrimage sites from within the British Isles itself, such as Canterbury. They have all been found in and around Chester, sometimes often watery contexts, but none of them, of course, were made in the city. They have been transported into the city. The tokens are small in size. Some of them are designed to be worn. We have depictions of people wearing them on hats or in their cloaks. Some of them, like the spoons, these are 2 spoon handles, perhaps were meant to be displayed in the home or perhaps kept in a private devotional setting in the home. They might be a reminder of that journey taken. Again, like the tiles, they're made in multiples. Masses of them are made, and they are made for a range of consumers and a range of people who have different amounts of money to spend. So some are very cheaply made from pewter. Others, like these spoon handles here, are made from silver. But what you can see, if you look very intently at the surviving ones, is the marks at the side there where they've been pushed out of molds. And so again telling us there's a mass market for these items. They're made in multiples. So let's look at these ones here in some detail. What are the stories these two spoon handles tell us? I know that you've already worked out that these are silver spoon handles that came into Chester from Rome in the later Middle Ages. I know that you've been staring intently again, and you've worked out that this is indeed the face of St. Peter with a cockerel on his head. What are some of the things we might think about as historians and archaeologists from this? Well, we might think of the way that Pilgrim comes to the particular shrine. They encounter that object, they purchase it, and then what was a mass-produced object that is made, undoubtedly for spiritual reasons, but also to generate profit and renown for the spiritual site, becomes a deeply personal memento of a religious experience for that pilgrim, especially when they take it away from the setting of Rome and take it back into the setting of Chester. It tells us about a meaningful interchange between the individual and these objects in the Middle Ages, and how it is actually the movement of these particular objects that activates that change and makes a change in the status of the people and things. They are also designed to be purposely mobile, to be transported across thresholds and boundaries, and they become meaningful because of their mobility. Shoes. Now, the Grosvenor Museum is very lucky to have a wonderful collection of later medieval and indeed early modern shoes. And I know that you already know that, of course, having leather from any period in the past is something remarkable due to the fact that it's just not preserved in the soil. So in Chester, we have some shoes that are almost complete and have been put back together. We have shoes that are of children right through to adults. We have parts of shoes that show us the processes of the shoemakers in Chester and how they manufactured these shoes. We have soles that were designed to be perhaps sold to consumers to be, repair their shoes. These are wonderful things to have. What are some of the stories they tell us? Well, we have these collections of shoes. A lot of them were discovered in waterlogged contexts, so they're brown in character, but they weren't brown originally, so not everybody in the Middle Ages had sad brown shoes like myself. With drying and preservation, you have to lacquer them and preserve them. They've also shrunk in size, so everybody thinks medieval people had very small feet, but in fact, the leather's just shrunk down. We can see insights into the manufacturing processes of these shoes as well. Shoes are interesting in the stories they might tell us as historians and archaeologists. They are closely associated with the body. I always look at my own shoes for some reason when I'm talking about this, and no idea why. They're closely associated with the body. They become molded by your feet. And the shoes that are in the collection of the Grosvenor Museum evoke quite eerily the feet that were once in them. So this shoe in particular, we can see the imprints of a person's toes within them. It's like the ghost of the medieval person is still within it. We have as well children's shoes, and this was one of the shoes were something that struck the academics. Having a line of the shoes of these past people in front of you and seeing this was something quite striking. It evoked the steps that were taken, the stories of these people as they moved from childhood through to adulthood, and told us a lot about, again, the fact that shoes were made in multiples and accessible to a range of consumers. They were repaired often. They weren't often thrown away, but perhaps were repaired much more than we would do so today. Keys. We love the keys. Well, I love the keys. So it's just a trial through me and my love of objects. But keys. Again, we have multiples of later medieval keys in the Grosvenor Museum collection. On the slide, you can get a sense. I've tried to give a sense of scale here, but we have some very large door keys, which are this. I'm going to show this in size with my hands here. And we have some keys which are very small indeed, about an inch or so in size. Again, they're used for a range of things. They have different locking mechanisms, so you can identify which have more complex locking mechanisms than others. And we can think about whether they were used for opening chests. In the Middle Ages, everybody had a chest in their home, and they often had multiple chests and caskets in and around every single room, right through from the peasantry through to the upper classes. And so a lot of these keys are associated with those chests, as well as with doors as well. The keys in the Grosvenor Museum collection come from lots of sites in and around Chester, but also from the Mells trading site that sits up in the Wirral as well. That was a hub of international trade in this period too. There's different complexities of locking mechanisms and designs on these keys. But this one in particular is a little puzzle, this one here. Again, completely the wrong size. I just have to do a lot of this in my talk. It's about this size in reality. And if you have a look at it, I think you can get a sense of how thin the metal is of this key here. Now, we've had several explanations about what this key may be. So is it something, Liz at the museum suggested it might lift a latch to a lock. Other people who are locksmiths have suggested actually it's part of a locksmith's toolkit in the Middle Ages, which is absolutely perfectly plausible as well. And this key was found at the Mells trading site on the Wirral just outside of Chester. What was it used to unlock? Whose toolkit was it part of? Is it for a locksmith? Who dropped it? We don't know. But keys are interesting objects in that they tell us about the ways objects, it makes us think these are mobile, but also they stop objects from being mobile, and they lock things away under key and lock, such as in chess, which I move to now. Chess. Now, this is a beautiful chess. This is in the collections of the Grosvenor Museum in Chester, and it was part of our exhibition. Now, there's a story to this. It was hiding under this desk here in the stores of the Grosvenor Museum, and I tripped over it. And so I said, oh, could this be one of the objects that we use? What is this thing? And Liz said, well, it's the 16th, 17th century goldsmith's chest from Chester. So immediately we thought this has to be part of what we are studying. And I've written an article on medieval chess, which I won't bore you with today. But this is us, as the academics in the workshop, peering at this chest. We couldn't get into it. So this is us, what do chests do? They kind of attract you to try and force it open, to try and peep into it. And we were doing exactly that. The chest has multiple locking mechanisms on it, including a false lock and a false key in the top. Now, we couldn't open it, but then for the exhibition, the technicians did open it. And what did we find? Well, not treasures inside it, sadly. I was waiting for that. I thought we're getting some documents or something like that. There was nothing inside. It was empty. But we could see the wooden interior, and we can see this beautiful metal complex locking mechanism on the bottom of the lid, which is two mermaids intertwined in a design, suggesting that the chest was sometimes meant to be presented with the lid open to an audience. What are some of the other things we know about this chest? Well, again, as I said, chests are in every single person's house in the Middle Ages, right through from the peasantry, right through to the upper classes. And trade guilds, like the goldsmiths' guilds in Chester, often have their own chest where they keep all the records and documents of their guild. So we think this is associated with the Goldsmiths Guild in Chester. This chest is a type that was manufactured in Nuremberg in this period and then exported all across Western Europe. So your challenge now is to go and find as many of these chests as possible in museum collections, and I want you to collect all the photos and send them to me of these chests. The Victorians called them Armada chests, and they were wrong about that, because they decided that these were chests that were associated with the Armada attempted invasion, but that name has stuck. So you will often find them called Armada chests. They have multiple false locking mechanisms, as I've alluded to. This one does. We've got about 3 locks in the front, 1 in the top, and they are renowned for their complex and beautiful iron locking mechanisms on the bottom. It is portable, this chest. It has 2 handles on the side, but it's quite heavy to lift. I'm not lifting it. But what do they tell us, some of these chests? They become meaningful through movement chests in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Some of you might know that it was commonplace in the Middle Ages that when you were married, that as a woman that you would get a chest full of items and take them into your new home. So often these chests and the items in it acted as a memory of that person's previous life, and then they symbolize their new status as they move into a new home. When we look at chests that are for nobility or royalty in this period, we see that often, because nobility and royalty move around residences in the Middle Ages, that they travel continuously with chests. And in those chests are the things with which they need to rule. So all the things that they wear, all the gold and silver that they carry with them, and all the monies as well. So in some ways, the chests symbolize their right to rule as they pass through their different territories. So, why then, if hopefully maybe I've convinced you that it might be at least interesting to study these objects, but how might we understand them in the present, and especially for Chester? Well, one of the things that we did in the project was we wanted to take the objects and apply them, put them into reconstructions with showing medieval Chester as it was. And we chose 2 sites to think about. First was a reconstruction of the exterior and the interior of St. John's in Chester. And I know a lot of you will be very familiar with this place. Why? Well, St. John's is a fantastic site, so there's one reason for a start. But as you will know, St. John's was also a major pilgrimage site in the Middle Ages for the Holy Cross. It's one of the major religious sites, therefore, in England, and it competes with that other pilgrimage site within the city of Chester in the Middle Ages, St. Werburgh, which later becomes, of course, Chester Cathedral. So we wanted to give a sense of the travels people took in the Middle Ages through Chester for pilgrimage, and also the fact that many people undertake pilgrimages still today. St. John's, as you may know, is also a key site in Chester, but it is rather outside the ambit of normal tourist ambit in Chester. That little ring road that I was walking around today has kind of cut through where it is in relation and it sits with the amphitheatre outside there. It's also a complex site to understand sometimes. Maybe it's just me, and that's fine. But of course, we've got the 14th century tower here at the front of St. John's that no longer remains. And we've got the complex site at the back of St. John's as well, which is currently in ruins. And so what might that have looked like in the 14th century? So we worked with a person called Martin Moss, who heads a company called Dextra Visual, who builds digital and virtual reality reconstructions. And we started the process of trying to model St. John's as it was from past plans that we had, archival records, to get a sense of St. John's in the 14th century. Now, when you're doing this as a historian, we try to be as accurate as possible, but we also sometimes have gaps in our knowledge, and we have to fill in those gaps through research, thinking about other ecclesiastical sites at the time as well. I'm going to give you a sense of these reconstructions in a second, but we came up with the idea of a central figure for our reconstructions, which was a medieval pilgrim. And obviously, we thought quite carefully about the complex tile patinations as well, using evidence from tiles excavated from St. John's, and that are still extant in St. John's, but also from excavations in and around medieval Chester. We also wanted to, well, I say we, it was me. We wanted to think about the 14th century water tower for this project. I'm very passionate about the water tower. So the why is because it is my mission in life to always say the way in which Chester was the most important port city in northwest England during this period. And this is sometimes, I feel, so a story that's really undersold about medieval Chester, and a very, very important one, which marks out the city as a really important point of commerce and trade in the Middle Ages. We have ships, we have evidence of the goods coming into this water tower. It's built in the 14th century to collect taxes from these ships coming into medieval Chester. And they come in from regional ports, and they come in from further afield, such as Spain, France, Ireland, and Scotland. And in that might have been a port of entry for some of our pilgrims as well. We looked at some of the archival records that show the goods that are coming into the port of Chester in this period as well. And we wanted to think about Chester as that important node in a network of trade and commerce across Western Europe. So this is the water tower as it is today. It's on a sunny day here, which we can all imagine in our heads. I find it a little bit of a hidden sight sometimes. Again, that 1960s ring road has scythed off that story of Chester and through the walls. And so it can be quite hard to, when you're standing on it, there is a beautiful representation of what it might have looked like in the Middle Ages. But when you're standing there, it is hard to imagine what it looked like, not as a park surrounding it, but rather as that waterways with those ships approaching it. So we set about reconstructing it with Martin through drone footage, scans, looking at the archival evidence, thinking about the ships, which kind of ships might have been able to come in, given the capacity of the estuary at that time, and its frequent silting up. And this was what, in part, we came up with. I'll show you the film, hopefully, in a second. Martin said he got very obsessed with the boats. And ships, sorry, not boats, and in terms of reconstructing them. And for me, this was one of the highlights of the reconstruction, to present this back to the people of Chester. Right, I shall now, here we go, attempt to minimize the screen and give you a little sense of this film with my clumsy fingers. So bear with me. Finish without the slides. So, the fourth point is how we might make these objects accessible to more people. And one of the things that we did with the project was, and you can see these on, we can always send round a copy of the slides so you can have a look at the pictures here, was that we wanted to take these objects into schools across Northern England and North Wales. Because as you might know, the cost of living crisis has affected the ways in which schools can get into museums and can get access to these collections. So we worked with the education departments within the University of Chester, and our trainee teachers set up a whole range of lessons around the objects. And we took them out into schools so that pupils could handle these collections. And what they did was they handled the collections, they discussed them, and they produced some amazing creative work on the objects. But they also produced work that was historically interesting and significant. It was a different way of processing history for these pupils and granted them access to these collections. In addition, we worked with teachers across the region who came in and gave us their time for free because they are fantastic, and they lent us their knowledge as subject and educationalist specialists to allow us to create object boxes that are now free and accessible to be loaned to schools across the region and beyond, so that teachers can use these boxes with their pupils right through from primary through to secondary settings. We had, because of the grant of the money that we had from the HRC, we were able to create resources for these boxes, and they are free and downloadable online on our website and in the boxes themselves. We held 2 exhibitions, one at the Grosvenor Museum and one at Chester Cathedral. And we also did pop-up handling in and around Chester with our students leading from the History and Archaeology Department at Chester, leading these. So all of these things were very important to us, and hopefully it will be a continuing legacy of the project, is that we would like to continue developing this work in terms of making the objects accessible to people of all ages, and we're working on developing a virtual reality experience which is based on the representation of St. John's in Chester. And we're keeping refining and using this, and we'll be looking for volunteers in July to come into Chester Cathedral and try these out, because this is what I would hope to be the legacy of the project. Maybe even one day an exhibition on medieval Chester that's permanent and static and tells that important story of Chester as a centre of commerce and trade and cultural exchange in the Middle Ages. So if you want to find out more, we have a website that's called mob.chester.ac.uk. You can type in mobility of objects across boundaries, and you can pop on there. There's films, there's more information about the objects. You can vote for your favourite object. I know you all want to do that now. And if this talk has not completely put you off medieval history and medieval objects, we also have a book out called The Mobility of Objects Across Boundaries that was authored by myself and my co-investigator of the project, Leah Clark, who is an art historian at Oxford, and that's available through Liverpool University Press. I warn you, it's an academic volume, so of course it is rather expensive, but you know, one to go on the Christmas list. So thank you so much for bearing with me today as we move through technologies, and I hope that's been of some interest today. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Catherine. As a resident of Water Tower Street, I will never look out my window to see it the same way again. That's absolutely fantastic to see that. We have some time for questions, so if you have a question, please sort of indicate, and we have a roving mic to come round to you. So I will come over here first.
Hi, I was somewhat surprised to see the white tiles on the inside of St. John's.
Oh yes, okay. So on the tiles on the roof.
No, on the pillars and the walls were all white.
Yes, the white. Yes. Yeah. So commonly, when we were looking into the paint that was used to reconstruct the interior of St. John's, we did research into what is existing within St. John's that we could use. So obviously we have some wall paintings that are extant there that show evidence of that, and we also have, in fact, evidence from, so this is where we have to take jumps in terms of what paints do we put where. And so we've used research from churches that are across Western Europe in this period that have these colours in them, and those were the colours that we put on St. John's, because these are the most likely to have been the colours that would have been used within it.
There's a question down here. I'll come to Peter and then...
Excuse me.
This has to be because secretaries keep...
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, Catherine. First, a compliment. I thought the video reconstruction was fantastic and must have cost you a lot of money.
It didn't actually, because Martin's fantastic, but...
In that case, I need his address. But after the compliments, you're implying in a way that in a long time ago, a lot of people were actually quite materialistic we think about ourselves as a materialistic generation, and I tend to think of this as a new phenomenon. Am I reading you right, that you're saying
absolutely
that
right.
people 1,000 years ago were pretty materialistic?
They were indeed, yes. You've read me absolutely right. And this is something that I think, yes, we assume that it's perhaps a more modern phenomenon, that from the 18th century onwards, there's really a consumer. So we have different, I didn't put these in the slides, we have different debates over when we might talk about a consumer revolution. And that commonly was situated in the 18th century in some of the historical scholarship. More recently, we've pushed those boundaries back to the Middle Ages and to the period that I'm talking about. We see what goes hand in hand is we have a commercial expansion across Western Europe that really takes off. It takes off from about 1000, but it really gets going around about 1200 in Western Europe. And with that commercial and trade expansion comes the explosion in items in people's homes. And we see the evidence for that both in our surviving archaeological remains that we have, but also with the documents that I work with all the time, which is household expense accounts, merchants' handbooks, inventories, and things like that. So there is a shift here, and this is an interesting question, and one which I've thought about. What is it that shifts in this period that people acquire more things? Why are they wanting to do that? Has something shifted in the way that they think about these things, in the way that they see themselves? Is there a difference between the attachment to people and their possessions? So this is something we're still thinking about, because luxury is a sin in this period, but nonetheless, you can acquire things if you're acquiring them for perhaps the common good, or you're acquiring them for use in ways that you might be reinvesting in yourself or in the community. So there's ways around that. So yes, they are, is the short answer. But it's an interesting one, so thank you for raising it, because I think it's important.
Mine's quite a straightforward question, and it goes back to the original one about the colour of the tiles. You showed us the floor tiles, and you've talked about the cathedral, but St. John's was the cathedral. So
Yes.
Were they discovered at St. John's or the more modern, more recent cathedral?
So some of the ones that are in the reconstruction are the St. John's tiles, and they are, so the one with the little stags and things like that, we incorporated the tiles that are from St. John's. And then some of them we took a little imagination leaps, and we've put in tiles. The three-hair tile is there within that. So again, these are meant to be representations. I'm not necessarily seeking to exactly represent what it was on the floor there. It's to give you a sense of the different combinations within that. So that was part of the reasoning. But what we wanted to show was the complexity in those patinations.
But they were the cathedral.
No, I understand,
They
yes.
were the St. John's cathedral tiles as opposed to the cathedral.
So
cathedral
one of the
tiles.
ones, so yes, we've got the St. John's tiles, yes. St. John's was the cathedral in that period, as I alluded to on the slide, that later on Chester Cathedral is Chester Cathedral as it is now. But yes, I think what I'm saying is we actually popped in the three-hair tile, which was excavated from the nave of Chester Cathedral, into our representation there. But the majority of them were built around the St. John's patinations that are extant and some of the tiles that they very generously allowed us to scan.
Ask a question. Your video is fabulous. It's a fabulous advertisement for your work. It's very engaging. Is it itself a research tool?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So when you do it, do you think, oh, that's how that must have been?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I actually got this question when I was giving a talk in Austria recently with this, and it is absolutely a research tool for me, because I work as a historian. You're looking at these objects, or in written documents and descriptions, or the ones that we have from excavations. And so it allows me to think about the ways in which they were used, because on that page they're rather static. So it's a real research tool for me to think about the interlinking, the complexities of these objects even further. And to think about the gaps that we also have in our knowledge and where I need to go next to fill in those gaps. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Yes. Can you just, I'll come round with the mic and then we can.
Thank you. This is probably a naive question. What was the reason that they would build another cathedral when they had St. John's as a cathedral?
This is always a sticky question, Chester. No, so we have different ecclesiastical sites. So St. John's previously is Chester Cathedral, and then eventually, as we move into the 15th century, the other site becomes Chester Cathedral. The reason for that, I don't have an answer to that for you. So if anybody else has the answer to why there was that transferal from St. John's through to Chester Cathedral, you are welcome to pipe up now, but that is an area that I just don't have at my fingertips at the moment. I know that there is the transition between the two, however. And that's why sometimes St. John's maybe is overlooked, because that past is not so well known as it should be.
One of the things you pass around were coins, and I just wondered, the coins that you've got, whether they're British coins or how far afield your coin collection goes.
Yeah, no, the coin collection is, I won't say the bane of Liz's life, but she's also an amazing collection of coins. And so we have coins in the Grosvenor Museum that are from Western Europe in this period. In fact, I think a Venetian florin was just found like a couple of weeks ago. So again, our coins come from all across Western Europe in the Chester collection, as well as being heavily weighted, no pun there, towards, obviously, coinage within the British Isles. So again, there's a sense there of that interconnectedness. And there's also that legacy of Chester as well as a very important place where coinage was minted as well. And this is another example of the way in which Chester should really be considered as quite a significant commercial site in the Middle Ages in the British Isles.
Question in this row? Yes.
Going back to the three hair thing.
Yes.
Unless I missed it, you didn't sort of say what you thought the symbol meant, but that it originated in China. Now, I've known
Multiple meanings. So depending on where it is, a lot of it is to do, the three hares, I'm sure you've got it already, is to do with aspects of fertility. So across a lot of different cultures, it translates into ideas of that. When it's presented in Western ecclesiastical settings, it, of course, has to do with connotations around Easter, and things that, so but it has some meanings which are more central to it. And then there's different meanings that are attached to it. So when it's placed in Western Europe than it might have had when it was used, for example, in China. But this kind of fertility aspect, this aspect of spring, is something that's global, if you like, as a meaning. Yes, and the Trinity, yes, of course. Yes, and the Trinity.
I was wondering when Christianity got to China, because I've no idea.
Oh, God.
But you're saying that it means different things in different places.
It does different things in different places. Yeah. So what I'm saying is the aspects of Christianity would be attached to it as it comes into Western Europe in the later Middle Ages, and that's why it's present within ecclesiastical settings.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's more. Any more questions? Okay, then I think you can see by the number of questions and the level of interest that you've generated, Catherine. So I think I'd like to thank you very much for a fantastic talk. Your missing slides will be circulated, I promise, which I know, having seen them, have some of the artwork that the children have done. So I think that would be nice for people to see. But thank you very much. Thank you for entertaining us this afternoon, and all good luck with your project.
Yes, and I was going to say as well, the university will be holding a Festival of Ideas, which is a series of free public events in and around Chester in the warm month, I say, from the 4th to the 7th of July next year. And we will be advertising this through to you as well. And we have some keynote speakers such as Floella Benjamin and David Olusoga, who will be talking at that, but also lots of different events where you can you can work with us on our research within the university. So we'd very much like to warmly invite you to that, and we will circulate the details of the website and how you can book through all the contacts.
That's great. Thank you very much. And if you are hoarding any of Catherine's treasures, please make sure they find their way back for the table. But if you join me in thanking her very much for fascinating.
Thank you.